Hello, my name is Nicholas Morgan. I'm an editor at Ahval News, and this is Turkey Abroad. Joining me today is Tünay Altay. He is a researcher and PhD candidate at Humboldt University of Berlin in Germany. Tünay, welcome to Turkey Abroad.
Hi, Nick. Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to devote this episode actually to talking about the situation for LGBTQ rights in Turkey today, especially since we saw some of the videos over the weekend of the marches in cities like Istanbul and Izmir and the heavy police response to each of these, which involved, arrests. Several protesters were beaten, and so on. And it's a continuation, really, of a pattern that we've seen at least since the beginning of the year, since the Boğaziçi University protests. But in particular, I wanted to focus on an article you wrote recently for the London School of Economics blog, and you mentioned the concept of political homophobia. The first thing I'd like to ask you is, how can you explain for us what that means? How can we best understand the term political homophobia in this context?
So when we talk about homophobia, usually what happens is we are understanding homophobia as a certain constraint or an oppressive tool that is limiting the lives or expressions of LGBTQ people. So political homophobia basically looks at the diffusion of certain anti-LGBTQ and homophobic policies in different countries. So this is actually a very historic moment because, as many of you will also know, now there are different countries like Hungary, Brazil, Russia. We are seeing in international politics kind of advocating for a certain new norm, new policies that are against LGBTQ. So what we are trying to do with the political homophobia is actually, this is a term first used by Meredith Weiss and Michael Bossia. They are looking at how homophobia really function as a part of a political in the political order. So what we do is that we are just not seeing homophobia as a kind of in passing or something that just happens, but we are treating it as a conscious political strategy, usually aiming to kind of get to some place. And often it is either, for example, justifying or legitimizing a certain police force, or maybe convincing the public onto a certain controversial subject, so on and so forth.
And it makes me think immediately back to the protests at Boğaziçi earlier in this year, in January, where a number of students had waved they were waving the rainbow LGBTQ flag, and then of course they had that artwork where it showed the Kaaba with the two flags mounted over it, which, needless to say, inspired a lot of umbrage from President Erdogan and members of the government. And then, of course, from around that time, the president came out and said, "quote unquote," there is no such thing as LGBT in Turkey. Then, of course, we also saw this repeat again with the responses to the withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention, which is aimed at combating gender-based violence and violence against women in particular. So would you say that, or rather, let me ask you, what role did you think political homophobia played in the state's crackdown in both of these cases, with the university protest and the protests over the Istanbul Convention?
So, I mean, as you said, this is not necessarily a new phenomenon, especially the issue about homophobic discourse or political homophobia in AKP under AKP's rule. But nevertheless, in the last protest, what we see is that again, there is a certain stigmatization of any LGBTQ symbols, including the rainbow, and we are also seeing a very increased politicization of these symbols as well. I think the shift was that maybe, I mean, some scholars would agree that this was maybe something that started with Gezi Park or maybe earlier, but now there's definitely a certain public recognition of what rainbow is, but what it stands for. So this can be read as positive and negative at both sides, because it is good for the LGBTQ movement and activists on the ground who are trying to be recognized and seen by the public. But on the other hand, now they are maybe further stigmatized by a certain like homophobic public that doesn't want LGBTQ people to be represented. So moving back to the case of Boğaziçi protest, obviously what we are seeing is a very like in a very simplistic version, an operation of political homophobia, because we are seeing a group of students and professors and people, let's say, coming with a certain demand, and they are criticizing a top-down implementation of something that didn't necessarily meet with the university standard. This is the new rector's appointment to Boğaziçi University. And at the end, like instead of maybe responding to this critic or responding to this need, what AKP and MHP government is doing is that they are targeting people by using certain stigmatized symbols such as the rainbow or such as the issue of religion, etc., to kind of first of all to minimize the political needs, and at the same time to silence the people's kind of wish to be heard in this case. Yeah, I mean, in doing that, I believe like in the short term, it may maybe help a certain like identity group to identify with the politics and say, hey, okay, I mean, the students are protesting, but maybe they are really doing something wrong or something against my beliefs. But on the other hand, we are seeing that now by targeting people just by using certain symbols, this actually also gives a greater ground for coalition in the opposition. So this is again, I mean, I guess the upcoming months will really show us what will happen.
And there's two tracks that really come to my mind with these responses, and one of them has to deal, of course, with the reasons why Erdogan's AKP and the MHP might be going this direction now, and then of course what that means for the Turkish opposition, like the CHP, KDP, how they respond to these. But first, the first of them, I'd like to start with the AKP and the MHP, because in your article, in your LSE article, that you wrote that the current stigmatization that is being faced by the LGBTQ community in Turkey has precedence, of course, in the AKP's targeting of other groups that it was opposed to, whether it was the Kemalists or the secularists, the Kurds, of course. And now that we have this partnership between the AKP and the MHP, so the prejudices of both are now shared and strengthened, so to speak. Why now, though, do you think it is the LGBTQ community that is falling in the crosshairs of this bloc? Really, do you think it has to do with the fact that the approval ratings for the current ruling coalition is sagging, that they're feeling troubled by that, and then of course with political scandals and an ailing economy? Or do you think it was just inevitable that the government would see this community as antithetical to, like, as an antithetical to their vision of Turkey? What do you think?
I mean, Nick, I would say this, now it is actually not very uncommon that a government like we have at the moment, when they kind of faced with waning popularity, they target a certain identity group that is often misunderstood or misrepresented, right? And in this case, this identity group is not only LGBTQ people, but as you rightly pointed out, this is like ethnic minorities, this is women who are part of this kind of like fight to bring back Istanbul Convention and fight for rights. So there are certain identity groups that are easily marked in the society and easily can be targeted. And so my kind of with the piece, I was trying to say that the reason that these groups are being targeted is that maybe the government already knows that these are wars that can be won. So maybe this can be one reason, because obviously, although there is a certain political organization, certain like a grassroots organization for LGBTQ people, compared to maybe other issues, AKP and MHP coalition knows that at least for their own voters, this is an easy battle to win, because there are no kind of like contentions, they believe, within the society. But again, it is, I mean, the reason that kind of like I posed the question of who's afraid of the rainbow in Turkey was that we also have to acknowledge that now we are not talking about a Turkey in like a homogeneous and singular setting where we only talk about Erdogan and AKP, but rather it is kind of like we are seeing a certain polarization now for the actors who are defining the like the central discourse of Turkish politics, which is a very interesting period. Now we are not, for example, seeing Erdogan speaking every day, which he used to do some years ago. And instead now we are seeing like Bahçeli commenting on certain things, and we are seeing a more stage given to the opposition, which is in this case Nation Alliance, as you pointed out, CHP and other coalition parties. So this definitely brings a certain plurality in the discourse, and also probably like the advocacy or the destiny of LGBTQ issues in Turkey. But for MHP AKP issue, I mean, this coalition is also not like seamless, right? I mean, they agree on some issues, but at the same time, like they've been in opposition for many years. So Bahçeli and Erdogan actually have a lot that they disagree on. So I think they are what they do is they are trying to stick on to the things that they agree on. And I mean, this is of course just my speculation, but in this case, LGBTQ happen to be one.
And this could be seen as trying to hold the base together, basically, because with upcoming elections, possibly 2 years or even possibly sooner, they're going to want to really get the most they can out of what could be considered a very socially conservative or nationalist leaning base of supporters the two share, right?
Yeah, and I think it is like, so that's also like one important point where we see the use of political homophobia, because even in the Boğaziçi case or the current use of homophobia in Turkish politics, this is not only directed at like creating hate in public or creating anti-LGBTQ bias in public, but they are both like trying to kind of like give a reason to their voters to vote for them again by creating this like environment of fear. But at the same time, they are, I think, trying to create certain separations in the opposition. So this is a very key component actually of like how they use homophobia these days. Because in the piece I also wrote about how now like the opposition, which is Nation Alliance, is like trying to build this block of like smaller parties to get together to kind of like beat this bigger quote unquote evil in this case. So I mean, that's at least how they build their policies, right? We have to get together, and we are talking about parties who are mostly like centrist, center-right leaning parties. And now I think this might be a big concern for AKP and MHP coalition, because in the next election, as you pointed out, they have some concerns. I mean, polling data also shows that there is some probability that they may lose the elections. And for that reason, I think they are also using this type of political maneuvers, political strategies to kind of understand what might be the issues that opposition coalition, in this case, Nation Alliance, may disagree on. So LGBTQ issue might be something that they disagree on, because I mean, when we consider all the different political traditions that each party comes from, and so it is clear that they wouldn't possibly come up with like a solid plan for LGBTQ rights, as they did maybe on some similar issues. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's why this might be like the use of political homophobia in this case might be to further the social polarization and to give a reason for the coalition government to question their coalition and to understand what they agree and disagree on.
And would you say that they're seeing any success with this in fracturing the Nation Alliance or the other array of opposition parties? Because, you know, of course, we have CHP on one hand, the traditional secularist party. We have the Good Party, which is splintered off from the MHP itself. And then, of course, the HDP, which, you know, the pro-Kurdish party that is that has been the most forward leaning into the topic of LGBT rights. And of course, separate from that, they're being challenged with a lawsuit to shut the party down. How do you think that this calculated use of political homophobia is paying off so far in being able to create divisions within the opposition?
Yeah. So I mean, this month has been very historic and very important, especially like considering this question, because we are in the Pride Month and
Yes.
lots of protests is going on. And I mean, so far, only the HDP representative Oya Ersoy was the representative who brought the rainbow flag to the parliament and spoke about the rights of LGBTQ people. And on the other hand, unfortunately, the CHP was maybe just showing a certain tacit support and saying, like, trying to form a certain criticism by claiming like freedom of press or like how people were treated by police, but not necessarily saying that LGBTQ rights are human rights and they have to be protected. So I think it is, so this actually shows that it might be working to a certain extent because CHP is still at least as
sort of.
hmm?
They're almost beating around the bush where they'll say that they support equal rights, but they're not going to come out and explicitly say LGBTQ rights, like in the way you said the HDP has.
Yes, so yeah, that's what I suspect, and it will be very disappointing because at the end, like HDP is not part of the Nation Alliance, the opposition alliance, and now there is, as you also pointed out, there is this like a huge like kind of attack over HDP representatives, and there is the possibility that the party might be shut down by the Constitutional Court. So this definitely leaves a certain, like we are talking about the 10-15% of voter basis. I mean, and then, I mean, of course, a certain, hopefully HDP won't be closed and the pro-Kurdish representation would continue in the parliament. But even in this case, Nation Alliance has to really play its cards very wisely because obviously there is a certain human rights crisis going on in Turkey. So at the same time, while they are criticizing certain misgivings or very questionable policies of the government, if they pick and choose the fights that they want to fight for and then leave out the LGBTQ issues, which is clearly a human rights violation, then it would definitely make the voter question their sincerity. And like obviously, so at the end, it may not necessarily pay off for their own benefit. But now I'm only speculating. Of course, this is just my guess as a person who's like trying to make sense of this kind of like certain political climate. I'm just personally a bit disappointed that they didn't choose to support it clearly. But in the Bozici case, for example, again, it was connected to LGBTQ people, but again, it was a tacit support showed for example, students. So they tried to build their political discourse over some other things, again criticizing the police violence, but while doing it they said, oh, these are only students, but not necessarily directly like pointing at, hey, actually rainbow flag is okay and LGBTQ rights are human rights. So this wasn't necessarily a political message.
Well, the last question I want to ask you is actually like based on the international dimension of this topic, because of course we have on one hand, say during the Bozici University protests, the U.S. State Department under the Biden administration was only days old, and they still issued a criticism specifically against anti-LGBTQ statements being made by Turkish officials. But then at the other hand, just this month also, we saw on the other end of the spectrum, Hungary enacted its own anti-LGBTQ ideology law, which they use the age-old excuse that they're protecting children from the ideology. And then, of course, Poland's another case that's worrisome in their LGBTQ free zones, and far ahead of either one of them is Russia, whose policies are well known at this point. But with the last round of anti-LGBTQ rhetoric and the growing focus seemingly directed at them by their symbols, so on, by the Turkish authorities. Do you think Erdogan is Erdogan or the government is openly cementing Turkey's place on the opposite end of the so-called pink line by echoing any of these countries and the rhetoric used against the LGBT?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it certainly does. I mean, now, as you pointed out, there is definitely we can see some scholars call it norm polarization, right? Because first it was the norm was normal, like a Western-centric or US-centric norm was the protection of LGBTQ lives, and many countries kind of use this to advance their international role in the world politics. But now with Russia, with Brazil, with Hungary, there is definitely a certain polarization where people, like when we look at, for example, Putin's discourse, I think it really kind of sums up the general mentality there. It says, okay, there is this like a religious liberties and religious conservatism. And for that reason, actually, and at the same time, like kind of undertone of Euroscepticism, obviously, because it's a position taking against European Union values, EU values, right? And so combining these with a certain West skeptic, Eurosceptic worldview, and coming up with the conclusion that actually being anti-LGBTQ or not promoting LGBTQ values is can be a moral regime or can be a moral stance. So now we are seeing globally that there is a group of countries, group of leaders who are following a similar kind of logic and saying that we have to protect, either with the protection discourse, we have to protect our children, or we have to protect our nation, or from a very interesting view on, like, even you may call it a certain like a post-colonial discourse, as in the case of Uganda, saying like, oh, these are the kind of like deviances brought by Westerners, so we have to protect our own like native culture, which is defined heteronormatively. So it is quite interesting, and I think it would be a very fitting kind of way to describe Turkey's position as well, especially considering its ties with Russia at some point, and then now, for example, neo-Ottomanism, and trying to position itself in the Middle East as the kind of a leader of a certain imagined political community, let's say. But so I think it is very much connected with the way that Erdogan, especially like if you even just look at Turkey-EU relationships, I think it really tells a lot about how AKP's position has shifted within the years on the issues of like sexual rights and women's rights and minority rights. It's I mean, we are talking about a very long leadership, and it hasn't been consistent. Let's put it this way. I mean, when you look at 2005, 2006, I mean, when some of the biggest LGBTQ like pride parades happened during AKP's AKP government. So, I mean, that's why, like, I guess to understand the political homophobia in like contemporary Turkish politics, of course, we shouldn't be short-sighted, because there is a past, and this past really tells a lot about how AKP or MHP is currently acting. There's the political tradition that they bring, which is in this case, AKP's Islamist views and MHP's ultra-nationalist views. And then there is this aspect of transnational ties, and where they want to situate themselves either pro-EU or anti-EU or somewhere in between, or whether they want to be closer to their like former allies in the Middle East. So I think those type of little moments really, or like calculations really change the way they promote or present themselves. Because otherwise, why would they? Otherwise, why would they choose to bring this topic? So this also proves the issue about political homophobia, because it is definitely something strategic. That is definitely something that speaks to the either national or international politics.
Tünay, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me for this podcast today, and to say that this was a great way to really mark Pride Month for Turkey abroad, to have this kind of discussion. And I look forward to really having you back sometime soon.
Thank you very much, Nick. It was my pleasure.
My name is Nicholas Morgan, and this is Turkey Abroad.